This is the kind of second out of 4 sessions or parts of sessions that we're going to be talking about this project that we did at the Levy Economics Institute that Ajit introduced yesterday. So today I'm going to talk about the actual macro model that we used and the kind of broad macroeconomic results. Next class on Monday, I'll again be presenting and I'll be talking about how we took those macro results and applied them on the micro level to look at changes in employment. And then the next day, I'll look at how that affects time use and time and consumption poverty in Ghana and Tanzania. So that's kind of the broad outline for the next few sessions, after which Martine will take over again and you'll all become CGE experts in no time flat. Now, okay, so the general idea for this model is that we're going to try to estimate the impact of additional government expenditures into a macro model, right? So Ajit outlined what we would be modeling, right? The investments in road infrastructure and in early childhood education, right? So those two policy interventions in Ghana and Tanzania, how are they going to impact the broader macroeconomic situation, right? So that's what we're going to do today. So there's a fiscal expansion, so we want to see what happens to major sectors of the economy and key macro variables, for example, external deficit, but also government deficit, employment, all this kind of thing. So the employment, the level of employment by location, so rural versus urban, and education. So, and we have 4 categories of education. So that's those who haven't attended school, those who've received primary education, so those who have secondary education, and those who have tertiary education, so higher education. So there are 4 categories, right? So rural and urban by those 4 education categories. So those are the factors of production in terms of labor that we are going to look at, right? So a lot of the categories I'm going to be talking about here today are those that Martine introduced yesterday when he was outlining the CGE model, right, based on SAM. Right? So the SAM categories I'm going to be talking about are these. So the factors, we have 4 labor factors, right? Finally, the level of consumption expenditures by rural and urban households, right? So that's going to be important in terms of figuring out the impact on consumption poverty, right? So the level of employment and the level of consumption expenditures are what we call linking variables. So because this is a macro-micro model, we do the macro model, and then some of the outputs of that model, the linkage variables, kind of play themselves out at the micro level, and we model that as well in a second kind of phase of the exercise, right? So these, the level of employment implies that there are going to be changes in employment for individuals, and the level of consumption expenditures by rural and urban households as a result of the increased income are going to affect people's poverty status, right? But they're also, these are also going to affect the pattern of time use, right? So if there are employment changes within households, there's going to be some shifting of responsibilities for household production work, right? So we're going to model that as well. Those things, right, as I said, those will be Monday and Tuesday. I'll talk about those. Okay, so this then is a top-down modeling strategy, right? So it's not a micro-founded model where we have some behavioral model and then we figure out what happens at the macroeconomy based on changes that we estimate for the at the micro level. It is, in fact, we start at the macro level and then find out what the impacts are at the micro level next. Right? So that's the deal. So excuse me. So the main features of the macro model, right, are, first of all, that it's a SAM-based multi-sectoral macroeconomic model, right? So the SAM for each country is the basis for the model. So we're going to use the SAM to figure out what the impacts are going to be, right, across many different sectors in the economy. Right? There's also for us, right, there's a distinction between capitalist and non-capitalist sectors. Right? So a lot of the activity, economic activity in the global south takes place in own account production units, right? So the family farm or the self-employed street vendor, right? So there's a distinction there in terms of the level of economic activity, the employment impact of an increase in activity in the capitalist and the non-capitalist sectors, and the distributional impact of an increase in economic activity in those sectors as well. So we're going to take those into account. There's also a synthetic care sector. So there's an early childhood education sector, right? So conventional SAMs don't actually contain a sector like that, right? So we had to create one. Right? So this is another example of economists making stuff up, right? So, but we base it on some good data that we gathered, right? But we have to have that there in order to model the impact of an expansion in spending on that sector, right? So that's why we have that there, right? So, but that's different than most other SAMs that you'll find out. Also, the closure rules, right? So, and Martin talked about this a little bit yesterday morning, they're structuralist, right? So we have an increase in exogenous demand. It's absorbed via changes in output, right? The savings rate and prices remain constant. So unlike CGE models, we're not assuming full employment, right? And we're not assuming that the ways that the economy adjusts to changes, to shocks, is through prices and wages, right? We're assuming that the wage is fixed and savings rates fixed. And so what changes are levels of output and employment. So, and also, government balances, the trade balance, that kind of thing as well. Okay. So in our case, right, so the level of employment that we find that is an output of the model is going to be determined by the change in total output, right? So that's going to be one of the main outputs of the model. Okay. So, right, so social accounting matrices. So what are we using here? So for Ghana, there's a social accounting matrix for 2013 that's published by the Ghana Statistical Service, along with the Ghanaian Institute for Statistical, Social, and Economic Research, and IFRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. And this was published in 2017. And so that's the basis for our model. So we're going to modify it, as I said, but that's the basic model. And for Tanzania, there's a social accounting matrix for 2015, produced by the IFRI and as part of the Nexus project, also published in 2017. So we have some fairly new, in terms of macro models, fairly new social accounting matrices to work with. And each of them have about 50 or more industries, right? which means we're going to do some aggregation. We're going to take those 50 industries and crunch them into 8 and then add another one, right, which is the early childhood education. Okay. Now, why distinguish between the capitalist and own account sectors, right? So what we're going to do in terms of the aggregation is there will be some sectors that go into the capitalist sector and some into the own account sector. So we're going to treat them separately in the SAM. And so there are good reasons for doing that. In economies like Ghana and Tanzania and many other countries, right, the private sector is largely own account producers, right? So family farms for subsistence or for markets or a mix, which is pretty common. Self-employed, right? So people working in the informal sector or maybe some small business that they have themselves. They include unpaid family workers, right, as a main part of the workforce. And so it's very different than the capitalist sector, which is wage labor. Right? The capitalist units employ wage labor, right? So that's a minority in a lot of sectors, in a lot of industries, in a lot of these countries, right? Whether they're kind of formal or informal capitalist units, the fact that they employ wage labor kind of defines them, right? But that's kind of very limited in a lot of sectors, right? Although it dominates many other sectors as well. Outside of the private sector, right, there's also public enterprises and agencies of the general government that provide public services, healthcare, et cetera. Right? And the SAM does provide a breakdown of the gross value added in every industry between labor, land, and capital. So since the private sector has, so many own account producers, right, we're going to produce imputations in a lot of sectors to assign income that accrues to each of the factors of production, right? So the standard SAM has value added, right? You'll remember that from Martine's exposition of the social accounting matrix yesterday, right? And it's broken down into labor, land, and capital, right? Which, for the own account sector, right, we're going to impute all of that income to households. Okay, so that's the basic idea. We're going to be doing these imputations to assign that income to that. So okay, so how are we going to differentiate between sectors that are capitalist or own account? Well, how do we do that? Well, the most defining characteristic is, of course, the employment of wage and salary workers, right? So that's capitalist production, right? The wage relationship is one way of defining capitalism, right? And so we use the share of imputed labor income in the total labor income of each industry in the SAM as a way to identify how prevalent capitalist production is in that sector. Okay, so the more labor income is a function of that sector, right? Is a share of the total income in that sector, the more capitalist it is, right? Because the more wage labor or salary labor there is in that sector. Okay. But of course, most sectors have somewhere between 0 and 100% labor income, right? So we have to choose some cutoff, and that's what we do. So we have detailed input-output tables, so we can provide that if you're interested. Right? Now, So the amount of value added, right, that goes to capital or land, right, is distributed among the various kinds of labor in own account sectors, right? So whereas in the capital sector, only labor income goes to households, in the own account sector, the total income goes to households, but we distribute it among the different kinds of labor that we defined earlier, right? So rural, urban, and the 4 categories of educational achievement. And so that's so that all of the income is distributed among those kinds of labor in proportion to their shares in the value added accounted for by labor, right? So that's how we distribute income in the own account sectors. Now, what happened? There we go. For example, right, agriculture in Ghana, right, in our SAM, the share of imputed labor income is about 97%. So labor income is 97% in the SAM, so it's a non-capitalist sector, right? For mining, right, the share of imputed labor income is 4%. So this is imputed labor income as opposed to actual labor income, right? So mining is a capitalist sector, agriculture is a non-capitalist sector, right? Because most of the labor is not wage labor in agriculture, and most of the labor in mining is wage labor, right? And construction is about 48%, and that's 13% of GDP. And it's also going to be important because this is the sector that the road infrastructure spending is going to go into. And so that's the capitalist sector as well. Right? So a large majority of labor in construction is wage labor, so it's termed the capitalist sector. So the breakdown by the share of GDP, the capitalist sectors are 45%, the own account sector is 42%, public utilities is 1%, so that's electricity, whatever else, and then public services is 11%, right? Okay. Right, so long story short, for sectors where most of the labor is wage labor, we consider them capitalist. If it's mostly not wage labor, we consider it own account, right? Although, for each sector, there's going to be a mix of, what, if we looked at individual enterprises, some would be capitalist, some would be own account, but if the majority are own account, then we consider that sector own account. Right? So just another way that, simplifying assumptions are used in building models, right? So, okay. So next important thing here is the early childhood education sector, right? So this doesn't exist, right? So we need the best data possible if we're going to, as accurately as possible, assess the impact of additional spending on early childhood education, right? But most SAMs or input-output tables don't actually represent this sector separately, right? It's aggregated with other sectors, with other activities like education or social services, right? So it's, maybe part in each or all in one or the other, but not a separate sector in and of itself in most SAMs. So what do? Well, we gather our own data. So we conducted a survey of about 100 childcare centers in both Ghana and Tanzania in 2017. And so what we collected was information about the cost structure for each childcare centers. Right? So early childhood education and childcare centers in both those countries. And so we get a structure, based on the different kinds of inputs, and then we use that information to map it to the commodities in the SAM and rebalance the SAM using cross-entropy methods, right? So that's technical stuff, and according to Ajit, whose slides I'm using, that's not to be discussed here. So that's super secret. Also, I don't know how to do it, so I can't really answer questions about it. Maybe Louisa can. Or not. Okay, so finally, this is the breakdown of the sectors in GDP in Ghana and Tanzania that we're going to use. Right? So in terms of the share of GDP, right, in Ghana and Tanzania, the own account agriculture is about 21 or 22% in both countries. Capitalist mining is much bigger in Ghana than in Tanzania. There's capitalist manufacturing, which is 5 and 4%. Own account manufacturing is 2 and 5%. Right? Construction is a much larger share, 12% in Ghana, 22% in Tanzania. Services are, the second highest share in both, more or less, in both countries, 19 and 18%. Own account services account for 18 and 19%, so flipped. But you can see that services are the largest component of GDP in both countries. Public services are 11 and 9%. And finally, our early childhood education sector, right, is the smallest at 0.1 and 0.2% of GDP, right? So we have 9 sectors that we're going to use in our SAMs, in our CGE, right? So we have nine activities, 9 commodities, right, in the SAM way to talk about it. Thank you, Louisa. Just saw Louisa's comment. Okay, so we have 9 aggregate sectors that we're going to use. We have 8 factors of production, right? The labor, and so in terms of kind of making it more concrete, the capitalist sector is 46 and 47% of GDP, right? And the own account sector is 43 and 44%. And then public services are 11 and 10%. Right. So that's just kind of adding up the own account and capitalist manufacturing, capitalist sectors, right? So capitalist mining, manufacturing, construction, and services account for 46% in Ghana and 47% in Tanzania. Okay. Okay, so any questions so far? So no? No questions. Okay. Well, all right. So we're at about 10:30. So let's see. Okay, well, let's move ahead. So let's talk about the actual model. Right? And we've kind of set up the SAM already, and now we're going to talk about how we're going to use the SAM. Right? And so just as in terms of setting up the SAM, the basis for the model, we had to make some assumptions. For the model itself, we're going to make some assumptions as well, right? Beginning with the technology we're going to use. Now, you'll remember yesterday morning, Martine talked about the choices you have in terms of production technology, right? And he showed you the Cobb-Douglas production function, right? I think he also mentioned the constant elasticity of substitution production function, or that came up in a question, whichever. We're not using those. We're going to use a Leontief production function, right? So this is a production function where output is is produced using intermediate inputs, capital and labor, in fixed proportions, right? So as output rises, each of those rises in the same amount, right? So there's no factor substitution allowed in Leontief production technology. So we're assuming that there is no factor substitution in the short or medium run, which is the kind of the time scale for the model that we're using, right? Because we're assuming there's going to be no or minimal price changes in response to the fiscal stimulus, it's not problematic. Right? So this assumption is not problematic based on the other assumption we make. Right. See how that works? Okay, so the usual assumptions in the CGE literature, just for kind of background, is that there's a nested production function for gross output of each activity, right? So each activity would have a nested production function associated with it, right? At the higher level, value added is combined with an aggregate intermediate input, right, to produce the final commodity, say bread. And then at the lower level, right, there are two nested production functions, one for the aggregate intermediate input, right, that shows the combination of actual individual intermediate inputs into this aggregate intermediate input. And then there's another production function for value added, right? That shows the combination of that combines the primary factors, right? Labor, capital, etc., to produce the value added bundle, right? So notice that value added in the usual framework, the kind of mainstream framework, that comes from the marginal product from each of the factors of production, right? So we're not playing that. But because no real process of production actually is like that, right? If you think about an automobile, right? A car needs a steering wheel and 4 tires, right? But you can't substitute between them, right? Right. Now you can use various combinations of capital and labor to produce cars, right? Depending on the relative prices, you can make that argument. But the idea of the marginal physical product of each of these kinds of factors, they can vary the quantity of labor while holding the intermediate bundle constant, just doesn't make any sense, right? There's no way you can produce more or less cars without changes in the quantity of steering wheels and tires. You can't really define the physical marginal product of labor or capital. Right? And so you can't then figure out their rates of remuneration, right? In the standard mainstream framework, wages are the marginal revenue product of labor, right? But if you can't identify the physical marginal product of labor, then you can't figure out the marginal revenue product either, right? So the standard CGE specification just kind of ignores this problem. And this goes back to the capital controversy way back when. And so they just assume that you can arrive at a marginal revenue product, and so wages. So, but we do not assume that. So for our results then, all that being said, for using this technology and the closure rules that I'll talk about in a little bit, for the scenarios we simulate and the closure rules we use, there aren't huge differences between a Leontief production technology that we use or a Cobb-Douglas or a constant elasticity of substitution production function. That would be a more standard mainstream approach. Okay. All right. So that's technology. Right. Let's talk about the factors, households and factors of production. information. So in terms of the household sector, right, we have two kinds of households, rural and urban. Their consumption demand we determine with a linear expenditure system. Right? And we estimate the parameters of those from the household budget surveys for each of those countries. And the linear expenditure system incorporates the idea that there's a minimum basket of consumption goods that every household needs, and the household spends on other goods after meeting that minimum. Right? So there's a minimum level that spending is going to happen, and then beyond that, it's kind of optional what other things they buy. Right? So that's the kind of framework in terms of determining consumption demand of the household sector. So we estimate that separately for rural and urban households. Okay. And then there are the factors of production that I mentioned before. There's 8 different kinds of labor, education versus urban rural. Right? And then there's one kind of capital in capitalist sectors. So who says you can't aggregate capital? Okay, so those are the factors in each of the in both of the SAMs that we're going to use. Okay, and finally, in terms of output and trade, right. Domestic output, right, is split between domestic demand and world market demand, right, based on revenue maximization subject to a constant elasticity transformation function. Right? So this is kind of a standard assumption in CGE models, right? And so there's it's basically a model that allows the capitalist sector to maximize revenue. Right? The total domestic supply is divided up into domestic output and imports, right, of each sector, and that's a composite. There for each sector that's aggregated into a composite commodity using what's called an Armington function, which takes into account the location of production. Okay, so I have a question from Aaron. Oh, okay. So why do we need an LES and not just use the data from the household budget survey? Sure. Let me go back. So the question here is why do we do this, right? So what we're going to see is changes, right? Changes in consumption based on changes in employment and income, right? So the question is, how will the changes that we find manifest themselves in changes in consumption demand among the household sector, right? So if as a result of the additional spending, which we'll find is additional income for households, there's going to be some change in their consumption, right? So we can't just use the observed consumption expenditures in the household budget survey. We have to use that information to try to predict what changes in income will produce in terms of changes in consumption expenditures on the different kinds of goods and services that households consume. Right. You're welcome. Okay, any other questions about that? So we have to somehow account for the fact that the household sector is going to react to the increased income, and part of that reaction is going to be increased consumption expenditures, right? Given the fact that we're assuming that their saving rate is constant. Right? Okay. So. So then back to this. So domestic output and foreign trade, that's right. So the output, right, the supply of each sector is going to be split between domestic demand and exports, right? And that's going to be based on revenue maximization, which is based in part, which takes into account prices within the country and the international market prices, right? So the output is going to be split between those two components, and the demand is going to be split between domestic output and imports, right? But those are going to be combined into a composite commodity using what's called an Armington function, which just takes into account the location of production, right? And so what you get then is total domestic demand is the sum of intermediate demand, consumption on behalf of households, and government investment and government expenditures, right? Oops. I'm looking for this, Luis. Okay, the CG outcome variables that are used for the microeconomic model. Okay. Right, okay. So what we're assuming is that prices are not going to change. So prices are fixed in this model, and as well as wages, right? So all of the adjustment happens in employment. I'm responding to Luis's question in the chat in case you're wondering what I'm doing. So Luis says regarding the outcome variables, right? So there's levels of employment and levels of income and consumption, right? So those are the output changes. But yeah, so prices are fixed. So it's all of the response is in terms of output and employment. Okay. Okay. Then by definition, then domestic demand is going to equal domestic supply, right? So because we define domestic supply as domestic output and imports, and domestic demand is intermediate demand, consumption, households, investment, and government expenditure, right? So domestic demand is equal to domestic supply. And that's because we include imports in domestic supply, right? Kind of artificially. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed Lucy's question in the chat. Okay. Right, food that's produced through subsistence farming, right? They do, right? So household budget surveys in countries like Ghana and Tanzania, where production for subsistence, right? So, for farm households consume some of the food that they grow, and they might sell some of it or eat all of it. It all depends. But those surveys have that information, and we take that into account, right? So a lot of the production that happens is directly consumed by the household sector. So does that answer your question, Lucy? Okay. All right. That's what I'm much more comfortable answering, since it's all about micro. I know about. All righty. So that's output and trade. So we can then talk about government and the rest of the world. Okay, and please let me know if I miss any other questions. Capitalist enterprises get profits, right? That's capital income, which they use for investment, paying taxes, and saving, right? So what we're listing here are the transactions that we saw in the SAM that Martine showed us yesterday, right? So capitalist enterprise get capital income, right? And they spend it on investment, taxes, and saving, right? The government collects taxes, right? That's their income streams, indirect and direct taxes, and they transfer funds to other institutions and purchase commodities, which is government consumption. They invest, right? And that's part of overall investment. And the difference between government expenditure and income is equal to government spending, saving, I mean. Right? So transfers to other institutions includes transfers to households, right? Since those are also institutions. And the transactions with the rest of the world include trade transactions, so that's exports and imports, as well as income transfers to and from the rest of the world. The overall balance is the total saving of the rest of the world. Okay. Okay. So finally then, we can talk about the closure rules, right? So Martin talked about this, right? We've got a lot of equations happening here, right? There are, mathematical equations behind all of the slides that I showed you. And because we have a lot of unknown variables and a lot of equations, we need to make some closures, right? In order to be able to solve the models, right? And so we're going to say that government saving and foreign saving are flexible. So we're not going to assume what they are, right? So those are going to adjust based on what happens in the model. Right? Investment, we're going to say, is exogenous, right? So savings just endogenously via changes in output and income, right? When in most of the literature, it's the saving rate of private and foreign sectors that adjust to bring savings into equality with investment, right? But that's not what we're doing here, right? So savings adjusts via changes in output and income. Okay. And importantly, we don't assume full employment, right? So in standard CGE models, you assume that there's going to be full employment by assuming that variations in prices are going to be the thing that balances out the system, right? But we're not doing that, right? So we're keeping factor prices fixed and seeing what happens to output and employment instead. Okay, so it's a classical closure, not a neoclassical closure. Right? So the level of employment that we're going to find is going to be determined by the demand for each type of labor, which is going to change as a result of the injection of investment by the government. Okay. So that's the model of those are the closures, I should say. Now, in terms of the distribution rules, right, we're going to specify these separately. So this is in terms of how do we distribute the income that flows from production, right? So in capitalist non-mining sectors, so remember there were 4 capitalist sectors: manufacturing, mining, construction, and services, right? For the non-mining sectors, we use a fixed nominal wage and a markup on unit costs to determine prices, right? For the capitalist mining sector, we fix nominal wage and given world market prices determine profits, right? So the determine profits, right? This should be profits as well. Sorry. So the nominal wage and exogenally given world market price determine profits. So the non-mining sectors are not are more or less assumed to be using domestic prices, and the mining sector since it's mostly for export, is assumed to be using world market prices. Okay. For the own account sector, we use a fixed own or family wage, right? And for public services, there's a fixed wage and there's a depreciation rate for public capital stock. Right? Okay, so that's how the income gets distributed. So that's how we figure out the distribution of wages and profit in the capitalist sectors, right? And the nominal wage is fixed in both in the capitalist mining sector. It's fixed everywhere, right? In the own account sector, we have a fixed own or family wage that we impute, right? And the nominal wage is fixed in the public services as well. Okay. And that is the model. Okay. So we've got the whole thing in our hands now. Right? So we had a couple questions already. Are there any other questions about the model? So the assumptions we make, the data we're basing it on, the SAM, right? For each country, we're taking the SAM that is published, aggregating most of the sectors, and then creating an early childhood education sector based on our survey of childcare and early childhood education costs in both countries. Right? And then we're applying Leontief production technology, and allowing outputs to determine employment in the final situation. We're getting changes in consumption expenditures based on a linear expenditure system for households, right? Okay, so we left off with the kind of end of the model specification. So let's see what we actually get as a result. So what are the overall results? Well, the magnitude of the shock, right, is this. So we get as a percentage of GDP, right, the spending is reflected here for each of the scenarios and for both. So we modeled 3 scenarios: the road improvements, the ECE expansion, and then both. So what would happen if we did both, right? And so these are the, for each country, these are the kind of policy goals that Ajit mentioned last time. And you can see that they're fairly sizable. The road improvement in Ghana would be 1.5% of GDP in terms of the outlays by the government. ECE expansion would be 1/3 of 1%. And so if we did both, it'd be about 1.75%. For Tanzania, a bit less for road improvements, about 0.4%, 2/3% for the childcare, and a little over 1% for both, right? You may notice the numbers for Ghana don't quite add up. I'm not sure why that is. And it's the same in the report. So I think we may have something, but the general idea is correct. Right? So these are the scale of the interventions we're talking about compared to the economies of the 2 countries. Okay. Now, in terms of the multipliers, so what do we get when we apply these shocks to the system that we designed in the last section, right? So we get this. So for the road improvement scenario only, we get an increase in, so this is the GDP multiplier, right? So what we get is a growth in GDP in Ghana of 3.5% and in Tanzania of 0.7%. As a result of the spending on roads. It's something crawling on me, don't mind me. So that implies multipliers of 2.35 and 1.9 for Ghana and Tanzania, respectively, right? So in other words, an injection of was it? Yeah, 1.5% into road improvement in Ghana gives you a 3.5% increase in GDP, total output. For ECE expansion, the multipliers are even larger, right? 2.5% for Ghana, slightly larger than the roads, and 2.4 for Tanzania, which is, you know, a good chunk larger than the 1.9 for roads alone. Because the size of those interventions are smaller, right? The increase in GDP for each is 0.8% of GDP and 1.6% of GDP for Tanzania. And if you did both, right, you get the multiplier is somewhere in between, so 2.4 and 2.3 for Ghana and Tanzania respectively. So if we did both of the policy interventions in the two countries, then you would get a 4.3% increase in GDP in Ghana and a 2.3% increase in Tanzania. Okay. So just to give you some idea. Now, because of the assumption of fixed proportions, employment also expands by the same factor as the GDP, right? So the GDP multiplier, because of the Leontief production function, means that employment multiplier is the same, right? So for every right, so okay, so for every dollar you spend, you get $2.35 of employment, in other words, or cedis or shillings in these cases. The early childhood expansion sector is more labor intensive than road construction and improvement. And so the multiplier effects are larger for the ECE expansion. That's why they're larger for both Ghana and Tanzania. Okay. Okay. In terms of the government and external deficits, right? These are important considerations, of course. As a percentage of GDP, right? Government and trade deficits are 6.3 and 5.5% in Ghana in the baseline, right? And 0.35 and 4.85% in Tanzania, right? If you look at the result for doing both of the interventions, so that's scenario 3. So that's the kind of maximum impact on government deficits and the external trade deficits. You get 7.3% deficit for Ghana. So that's a one percentage point increase in the deficit. And the trade deficit doesn't really change. For Tanzania, the trade surplus doesn't really change. For Tanzania, the government was running a surplus, but that would become a deficit of 0.37% of GDP. Okay, so there's almost no change in the trade deficit. Right? The changes in the government deficits are relatively small, right? The debt service paid on external debt increased between 2011 and 2017. So this isn't a result of our model. This is these are numbers from the actual government accounts, right? So from 0.77% to 4.27% of GDP in Ghana, and 0.2 to almost 1% of GDP in Tanzania, right? So
we have a question
okay.
in the chat, real quick.
Okay, do the multipliers change little? So I'm applying a neoclassical. Okay. Yeah, I don't have that number, and I don't think we even put that number in the report. The changes by applying the constant elasticity of substitution production function would not be large in terms of the GDP. they might be slightly, it might mean that the employment multipliers would differ from the GDP multiplier, though. That's right. I don't have those numbers, though. But because the change in output wouldn't be all that different, you know, I don't expect the employment multiplier to change too much, but because it's a constant elasticity of substitution production function, which allows substitution of capital and labor, there will be some adjustment. There would be. So, yeah. Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Okay, so this is, you know, this slide kind of encapsulates the dilemma for many countries in terms of development strategy, right? So do we have better infrastructure for people or continued servicing of foreign debt, right? And that also kind of leads into kind of, you know, it highlights the fiscal binds that many developing countries find themselves in, and calls on us to consider, you know, the historical development of that bind, right? So the practices, the many ways that developing countries or the developed countries have used to you know, enrich themselves, that have produced this, you know, including imperialism and colonialism, structural adjustment programs, right? That leave many countries now with these debts, right? That they have to continue service before, you know, kind of caring for their own people. If you know, in terms of foreign debt, by the way, if you haven't if you haven't read Odious Debt, which is a book by Nikumana and Boyce, I'll put that in the chat here. I highly recommend looking at that if you want to look at if you are interested in the nature and the source of a lot of the debt burdens that many developing countries face, especially in Africa. Right? Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world, by the way, as a continent. Right? I wasn't saying Africa was a country, but because of the ways that the debt crises unfolded and the structural adjustment programs unfolded, the ways that Western banks, banks from the global north more generally, enabled the embezzlement of aid money and aid loans by leaders from the global south, you know, that which later became public debt. Right? So there's a whole lot there. But anyway, it's a great book. You should read it. So that kind of brings us to the end of my presentation. So for any questions before we move on to having a little bit of group discussion? Oh. Yeah, it sounds like South Africa and many other countries. We'll see, for sure. Okay. All right. Well, let's do this then. So we're going to do breakout groups, and we're going to talk about these questions here. Right. So the top-down modeling strategy we adopt, right, does have limitations, and you know, spillover effects from road improvements on macro and micro economic activity are, you know, ignored. Although you can expect that improved roads would have an impact on, economic activity, right? Perhaps increasing it, reducing costs for transporting goods and services might have a good impact, right? The same holds true for the positive externalities from expanding early childhood education. Now, we are, in the last section, right? So on Tuesday morning, we will talk about the direct effects of increases in these road improvements and early childhood education expansion on time use within households, right? So you can set that aside for now, but talk about other possible spillover effects and positive externalities as a result of these policies. So road improvements, expanding early childhood education, and how then can you kind of interpret the findings, right, in light of the limitations that you discuss. Okay? So the limitations being the lack of the spillover effects being incorporated, right?